We are looking at the justice of God and the injustice of man is the theme today. Daniel 6 we're going through. Probably one of the most popular chapters, along with the fiery pit and all that stuff. This one is now the lion's den. And time and again you'll hear about Daniel and the lion's den, or certainly his friends rather in the lion's den. His friends in the pit and Daniel in the lion's den. You'll hear that he prayed regardless of the new law that was meant to stop him from praying, that we'll read about today. And there is a spoiler alert. You will hear that Daniel was in the lion's den and didn't get eaten because an angel protected him. And the theme often is, of course, how Daniel trusted God when he was effectively told to reject his God by the law of the land. You will even see in your Bible that the added subtitle at the top of Daniel 6 is something like Daniel in the lion's den. But when you read the chapter, I don't actually think the main focus here is really on Daniel in the lion's den at all. In fact, there is very little mention of Daniel in this chapter overall compared to all the other people that we find in it. It was more what King Darius did, more what he went through during this whole incident. And we looked last week, at least in part, the question of why do bad things happen in the world caused by bad people if a loving God truly exists. So today I want to explore the subject of perfect justice of God and the flawed justice of man. And what I hope to debunk, as it were, is the often touted statement about how God is unfair, or how seemingly he appears unfair for those that have that view. And I hope we'll see that the Bible clearly shows a God who is fair, who is consistent all the time in everything he has done and everything therefore he will do. In doing so, it will expose the real truth that man-made justice tends to be built on self-indulgent motives that aim to consolidate power for ourselves. And I want to show then in contrast how God is constantly, consistently fair in his justice. So I think the application for us today is that we should seek to align our decisions with God's principles of fairness, his principles of compassion, his principles of truth, rather than being influenced by external pressures or self-interest. So, just again, we need to, because we've kind of moved on, most chapters will find that they quickly move on to the next thing and the next king even, or the next ruler. But this historical setting in Daniel 6 is that Babylon has fallen to a man identified as Darius. In his new role, Darius organized his kingdom of Medo-Persia by setting 120 leaders over various aspects of his kingdom, which we'll read about. And these were titled satraps, I suppose that's how you pronounce it, from a word that refers to a governor, a high officer, an officer of some kind, or even a prince. But we would probably call these officers that he has appointed here. One theory of who this king is might have been Gubaru, King Gubaru, in the historical record as well. He was a general under King Cyrus, and he was later given control over Babylon by his king after he led armies into Babylon. If this is the same person, which we suspect it is, then he reigned for 2 years and he died in 536 BC. So I can't give you any other evidence this time to show, is this the same person? The pattern of it tends to be that the Bible, I'm going to say without trying to be biased, is correct. This king did really exist. It did prove that before. It may be that we just haven't found the archaeological evidence or the evidence as such to prove that in the historical record as such. But the Bible is an historical record, written by eyewitnesses, written by people who were there. So let's dive in straight away. It is Daniel 6, verse 1 to 5 to begin with. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. Satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could not find any corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Oh, Daniel, would you please come back to this world and help us today? Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. Let me go back there. So, I don't know if you've heard of the term micromanaging. You would have heard it at some point in your life and in recent times. But micromanaging is controlling through supervision of details and scrutiny. That's the kind of general meaning of it. There's sometimes a need for this. Sometimes there's a good reason to have micromanagers. And sometimes they can be overbearing and they can impede a lot of the work that you need to do in your life and in your job. But in this case of the king, he was good at dispensing with so much responsibility as possible that he appointed these 120 officials. So the political structure was that the 120 officials would be accountable to 3 administrators. And the intention here is to reduce the chance of corruption. After all, out of 120 people, there would likely be some sort, one at least of those, would be looking to try and gauge some sort of power within that and try and influence other people. So these officers were put in charge of these, the administrators were put in charge of these officers. And so what they would do is they would create this environment where it would try and avoid embezzlement, fraud, as it were, so that these officers, 120 officers, could not get away with just kind of feeding their own pockets, taking off the top and putting their money away and taking the king's money, as it were, away from him. But every leader is concerned about their own reputation. And we'll see this in the king as well. And the attitude would have been to make sure that each king's reputation was not harmed by someone else's greed. So hence this political system was set up. If anyone was going to justify greed, then probably the king would no likely find a way to do it themselves and for themselves. But instead, King Darius wisely hands off a lot of this into officials and wants them to manage it. And again, we find ourselves with this early example of what happens when people are happy with the appearance of law and order and of justice, but do not want it applied to themselves. We see that they do not like that Daniel is going to be over them, in charge of them. The 120 officials so annoyed by Daniel's attention to detail and truth that it means they cannot get away with what they want to get away with. So it appears they try to find in Daniel what they know is actually within themselves, a corrupt and selfish heart. Their act of trying to find what's wrong with Daniel is a revelation of who they are. And yet they don't obviously realise that, they don't acknowledge it. But in fact, finding what's they want to find in Daniel is in fact what's really in their own heart, which is selfishness and corruption. But I look at this and think of that thing we need to do to make ourselves feel okay about being lawbreakers. It comes back to this thing that came into my mind. It's not just me doing it, others are too. And there seems to be a kind of, it's okay when other people are doing it too, so therefore I can also be allowed to do or break the law or do something wrong because there's others as well. And there's a need to feel that others are as bad as us. But not in order to understand the depths of our sin, not in order to understand why we need Jesus, rather to justify our bad nature and our sinfulness. We might say if everyone else is the same, then at least we're all in the same boat. Of course, that attitude tends to capsize the boat rather than look to protect the occupants of this figurative boat. It tends to be everyone for themselves. Now, they said the only way to get to this Daniel is if we use the belief in his God and the obedience he has to his God against him. How can we do that? In effect, how can we put, they say, a stumbling block between Daniel and his God in regard to what he has promised faithfully to do for God? And so then we continue, verse 6 to 9. So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, "O King Darius, live forever." They're such grovelers. They grovel to get what they want. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce a decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. And this is an interesting situation. The setup here is that there are 3 administrators over 120 officials. But the officials and the administrators, not Daniel, all seem to have colluded together in some form or another, and then went direct to the king. And they say to the king, we have this backing. We have these people that agree with us. We all agree that this law should be put into place. And I think what they did was when they went to the administrators, they leveraged some jealousy, I think, the other administrators had of Daniel. And what these 120 officials then did was convince them, well, look what he's doing. What will he do next? Will he take your job? Will he get rid of you? And so we get this sense that they're actually trying to use it as a way to whip up, to stir up a problem that probably isn't there. But they speak to the heart of these other administrators and get them convinced. And so we see even these overseers, these administrators, can be corrupted if you really speak into the heart of what they want. We find that even today, don't we? We can find that there are people who promise things, certainly in our government, and then when it's time for government, they roll back slowly. They're influenced, maybe, shall we say, in some way or another to water down things, to change things, because it doesn't quite suit the narrative of those that it will affect. So they demand that the king puts this law in place to stop anyone from praying to any other god during the next 30 days, except if it's the king. And you see how clever they are. They say, oh, but not you. You're great. And we want everyone to keep worshipping you. It's okay that people worship you. So the administrators are there to ensure that there's no corruption. But the officials use that system to make their requests seem acceptable. They corrupt, in a sense, even the other administrators. They game the system. A story as old as time, right? Gaming the system, which still goes on today. Because the administrators' oversight gives them credibility. So they'll go to the king and they say, not only us, these other administrators also feel this way. It gives them some sort of credibility to the king. So the king is like, well, of course, if they're in agreement with them, then therefore it must be right. But what they're doing is this. They're putting on this appearance of justice. They're putting on this appearance of what is so-called right. But it's still flawed enough that people can take advantage of it. They're not being insubordinate by appearance. They're not even insulting Daniel to the king. They're very carefully crafting a piece of legislation that they know will affect Daniel, but clearly they know they can get away with it if they present it to the king. He won't think about that this will affect Daniel. But their motive is purely to rebel against authority. And it is, as we've said earlier, mainly because Daniel, and at least before this, the officials, stopped them from being corrupt. They stopped them from doing corrupt things. But they want to be corrupt, so they need to get rid of Daniel. They need to get rid of this honest guy. Why have we got this honest guy who is looking over us and doing his job really well? Don't want him. Want to get rid of him. And so I thought of this verse here, Proverbs 14, verse 12. There is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. This is what they are doing. It seems right to them, and why does it seem right to them? Because their heart is sinful. Their hearts are full of corruption and deceit, and they want what they want. Our ways appear right, not because we're naive, but because of that appearance of right suits our skewed moral compass of right. If my heart is about corruption and it's about my selfishness, then the way I go, I will justify and make it right in my eyes because it suits my goal. And so we have things even brought into law that may have the appearance of doing good work, but actually leaves so many loopholes underneath it that we find that people will take advantage of those things. And it's designed in some way or another that we might suspect has been done on purpose. So my sense of justice is that we stop the person who's trying to save us from ourselves. Daniel is really saving them from themselves. Daniel was there to save them from their desire to be corrupt. But we often, we speak about Jesus, do not know what is good for us. We think something is good for us because in the moment it seems to make sense. It works for us. But in the same way, Christ died in order that we be saved from ourselves. Christ died on the cross so that we would be saved. He took our attack on him on the cross from the very people he was dying for. And why? Because we don't know what's good for us. But we find these same tactics being used by the Pharisees to goad and manipulate Pontius Pilate to punish Jesus and to kill him. We see this in John 19, verse 12. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jews kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. This is the worst thing you can say to Pilate. Pilate is under Caesar and he has to do everything he says. If this gets back to Caesar and he believes it, Pilate is in trouble. And so we do find it in Daniel 6, verse 7. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce a decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown... Oh, that's the wrong one. Is that the right one? It is the right one. Sorry. Shall be thrown into the lion's den. It is the right one. But in both cases here, it speaks into the pride of these rulers. What they're doing here is kind of speaking into the king's pride right now. In the same way, they're speaking into the pride of Pilate and saying, look, you hold this man dear. You will do everything that he tells you to do. If he hears that you're not doing that, he's going to come after you. And instead of doing what is right, he does what works for him. In the same way, to some degree, the king is doing what works for him. He's been presented with a thing that says, clearly this is right. You shouldn't be praying to any other god except this king. And so he says, oh, yeah, you're appealing to my pride. Why wouldn't I agree with that? But in both cases, it speaks into the pride of these rulers. With Jesus, they depict Pilate's refusal as him rebelling against his boss, Caesar, even though Jewish leaders had no real respect for Caesar at all. With King Darius, they set the worship of him as the more important thing than the worship of any other god. And in the eyes of the people, he could think this might show weakness if he does not agree. Especially if he didn't think himself worthy of worship. If that got out, people might think, oh, this is a weak king. But in both cases, their pride and position is leveraged against them. It's used against them for people to get their way. And so then he continues, Daniel 6, verse 10 to 14. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Just wondering, did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or man except to you, O king, will be thrown into the lions' den? I seem to remember something being mentioned. The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the laws of Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." They then said to the king, "Well, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. What we know is that this is clearly a trap, that there was intention all along was to trap the king. When Daniel heard about the decree, this man of God is not going to suddenly say, "Looks like I'm on my own on this one. All this time living, all these years, suddenly I will stop praying and believing and trusting in God." Instead, he makes it clear that whatever the circumstance, even a decree that tells him not to do the thing he has to do and wants to do, he's still going to do it. He's asking God, the text says, as he usually does, "Lord, what do I do?" Now, the way the officials phrase this question to the king is, of course, interesting. Verse 12 says, "So they went to the king, spoke to him about this royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days anyone who prays to any god or man except to you, O king, be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree shall stand. The decree stands in accordance with the laws of Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." Now, the reason why, there's 2 reasons, I think, why this question is phrased this way. Firstly, they know the king favours Daniel and holds him in high regard, and so they put it to him. But secondly, since the king signed this decree in the law of Medes and Persians, it literally means, when they say that, to be irreversible. So they make that statement in a couple of places in our text to mean once you do that, it's irreversible. You can't change it. You can't go around it at all. But the king and the officials know one more thing. The king knows he cannot make Daniel an exception, for that would weaken his authority in the eyes of these officials. This would go against the political structure he set up to stop people from being corrupt and contradicting the law. And so the officials know this, and they use it against him. And so they trap the king in an unescapable bind. They tie him up with law and legalism to trap him, as well as Daniel. Verse 13 to 14 says, "Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. This is a problem, isn't it? Because he makes every effort, but it won't mean anything, because there is nothing he can do. But it does speak of a very different approach of King Darius to King Nebuchadnezzar, to even the previous king. It speaks of one who does, and we saw that, he values Daniel. He really does respect his skill, respect his work, his trustworthiness. And whilst he's going to make every effort, we know there's no way he can get around this. So then it continues, verse 15 to 20. "Then the men went as a group to the king and said to him, 'Remember, O king, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed.' So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, 'May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you.' A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace, spent the night without eating, without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, 'Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?'" This is an incredible part of this account. never have I seen someone, probably, we may see it in another place, but certainly this king has such respect for Daniel that he cannot even sleep. He cannot even get any sleep that night. And remember, what he had to do was he had to roll this stone, or they rolled the stone over. Not only that, he literally sealed his fate with the signet ring. So a literal sealing of his fate. He seals it to say, this is the king's command. This is what the king has done. And it doesn't say it, but I imagine that must have been incredibly painful. Because it is clear that King Darius does not want this to happen to Daniel. But he has to carry out these edicts that he brings into law, even if it is someone he truly respects. Even more than that, the king knows Daniel's unrelenting dedication to his God. And I think of that scene when he says, may your God save you. I don't know what that must have been like, just to shout in there the last time he sees him and says, I hope your God saves you. But the king does acknowledge that only Daniel's God could rescue, should he choose to do so. And we do need to see one big difference here between that of Daniel's relationship with Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel's relationship with Darius. Nebuchadnezzar was quick to relent to those officials around him and attempt to put Daniel and his friends to death. There is a similar pattern here in King Darius, only when it's revealed that Daniel is affected by this, he doesn't want it to happen. We saw. He tries every way to try to save him from it. Whereas King Nebuchadnezzar seems to literally go whatever he was told. He didn't even try. After Daniel was still obedient to the king, he didn't even try at the first time to stop them from doing it. He just says, yep, you've spoken to my pride. I can't have this guy coming or seemingly rebelling against me. King Darius is more like Pilate. Pilate reluctant to condemn Jesus. But he still valued rule and reputation above what was right. King Darius was reluctant to put Daniel in the den, but he did so in order to protect his rule and reputation. But the foolish law the king had enacted had, so he thought, led someone whom he respected into a gruesome death. The unjust and terrible loss of an honourable advisor means he's unable to find any comfort and so sleep soundly, even enjoy the entertainment he would normally have at night. I'll leave that to your imagination. You know what entertainment means. It's a king of ancient times. You know what they would have done. So even then, they didn't want any of that stuff. That's a lot. That's a big thing. A king of this time, what probably many kings would have done is said, I want that to take my mind off of it. I want this entertainment to take my mind off of it. But so affected was he that he didn't even want that. He couldn't eat. So as Daniel's God, as King Darius said, rescued Daniel from the lion's den and kept him safe, well, of course he has. Daniel 6:21-25 says, Daniel answered, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. I'll get there. I'll explain why that happens. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language throughout the land, may you prosper greatly. Daniel appears to be still so very respectful of the king. And that's likely because he understood the bind that the king was in. But he of course knew that the king in part invited that on himself. He'd let pride get to him. He'd let them speak into it and let that pride overpower him. But Daniel shows this grace towards the king. And he's only able to do that because of the grace he knows that God has given him. He passes on what God has done for him. Shows grace to the king. But as we read this, we can't overlook the parallels of Christ in the tomb. Seemingly an impossible situation that a dead person can come back to life. Obviously, the most important difference between Daniel's exit and that of Jesus' exit is that Daniel had not died. Daniel went in alive, he stayed alive, while Jesus died and was buried and then rose from the dead. But it does say, Daniel says, I have not broken the law, I've not done anything to you, king, he says. And technically, Daniel was sort of breaking the law because they'd brought this law in. They said, you can't pray to any god, and he was praying to a god. When Darius issued an edict prohibiting prayer to anyone but himself, Daniel deliberately ignored it. Yet Daniel is also right when he says he's never done anything wrong before the king. He was innocent before God and had done nothing to harm the king at all. The law, as it turned out, which Daniel had supposedly violated, was a malicious conspiracy with no other purpose other than to trap him. It did not have the best interests of the king at heart. So Daniel makes the appeal on the basis that what he has done has causes no harm to the king whatsoever, whereas this law was actually only there to help those who are out for themselves, to become corrupt, to get rid of Daniel. A quote here says, Daniel did break the king's law, but he did not go against the king or against the king's best interest. Daniel is an example of obedient disobedience. Yeah. And that's how we operate, right? Because we can disagree with our governments. We can disagree with even laws that are put in, but there's a way of doing it. There's a way that shows grace, still shows mercy to those, as God shows mercy to us. We can still disagree. It's about respect. You see what Daniel's done? He's still respectful to this ruler. He still does it respectfully and says, you're in charge, if only because he knows God has allowed this man to be in charge, at least for this time. And so it's a really important aspect of a Christian's life is that the reason why we still sit under the authority is God tells us to sit under the authority of the ruling government. But that doesn't mean we agree with everything that government does. And so Daniel shows us here this really good example of how to be obedient to God, but rightly so, disobedient because the law that was put in place was actually flimsy. It was all about someone else's evil scheme, as it were, to get what they wanted. But the king accepted what Daniel said, that he didn't break the law, he didn't do anything to harm the king. And I think that's right. What I think from the king's point of view is that he saw Daniel's God save him. And so I think now he's thinking, so Daniel must be okay. He must have been all right to do what he did because his God has saved him. And even Darius acknowledges that this God is the living God that has some power. He acknowledges some power of this God. So he says, if your God saves you, maybe I think what he's thinking is God has judged him as innocent. God has not allowed the lions to get him, to eat him. And really, what human law could override that? But then, of course, it's somewhat unfortunate that we now have from one extreme to the other, that the king had not properly fully understood God's grace on Daniel, and so should have obviously acted that grace onto those that were even trying to trick him. And instead he throws his officials and their families into the lion's den. This isn't, sometimes people use this to say the Bible is horrible, and this is why we shouldn't believe in it. This is ancient culture. This is what they did. When officials did something wrong, it is noted, it is seen in history that they would put their entire families to death when one of these officials would do something wrong. It was a crime against the nation, it was considered as. And so it's not the Bible enacting some sort of okay for King Darius to do it. It's really just depicting the culture of the time. This is what these kings would do. They would not have their power changed. They would certainly not entertain someone tricking them into signing a law, especially the gravity of which they attach to it, which is that it's irreversible. So you see, all of that rage and anger comes from that place because they think, you've tricked me. You have put me in a position where you knew this was the reason for it. And so the ancient culture of this time is to kill the families of those people. But it did prove one thing, which was helpful, just in an evidential way. The lions were hungry. They were hungry. Think about the families, the amount of people that would have gone into there, 120, maybe not all of the officials, but certainly the ones that probably led that group, and then their families went in. It is proving a point. It's horrible, but it's proving a point. The lions were hungry. Daniel stayed in there all night long, and not once did the lions eat him. So we know there's a miracle happened. We know the angel has come and has stopped these lions from eating him. And I love these little bits. As horrible as some of these things can be, it proves the Bible to be true. It proves the accounts of these things to be true. And so then he continues, 26-28, I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. We find the king acknowledging the holy God in much the same words as Nebuchadnezzar. And while I don't believe that King Darius at this stage believed in God, I do think that there was a lesson taught to King Darius. I think it exposed the flaws of human justice, or really what is human injustice. It's what we create in order to make ourselves win. We want to be the winners. And so there are people in power that have certain power that will influence and say, I'm going to try and get this in order that I benefit from this. Expose the flaw in our system that humans, sinful people, put in sinful things into the world. They put sinful laws into the world. In this case, the king was swayed by the deception, but the deception spoke to the king's pride. He's not innocent in this. This is an unjust situation for Daniel, but it was not one put on Daniel by God himself. It was by human choice to scheme and use flawed human justice to their own advantage for their own selfish gain. But I go back and think about Daniel's prayer when he heard about the decree that could well have been a prayer that we might find in Psalms. And Psalms is rich, full of God's law about how they're so grateful and worship God for it. But one of these is Psalm 19, verse 7 to 11. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are sure and altogether righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the comb. By them is your servant warned. In keeping them, there is great reward. I think as we've read this in Daniel 6, I think it does remind us to place our trust in God's perfect justice. It reminds us that whilst we cannot always do it, we need to, as best we can, live with integrity, courage and faith, knowing that God is always faithful. God is always just. And even as God shows no favoritism in the way he puts down perfect justice, he promises that for those who trust in his ways and his laws, they will be delivered by them. The law will deliver you from sin, and Jesus will bring you into salvation. As we stand on the other side of the cross, Jesus has fulfilled all the law of God, it says. And by his blood we're given grace and are saved by his work. Far from being unfair, God's justice is perfect, waiting to deliver those who believe in him from death into life. There is one thing here that as I was just writing this last part, and I thought, this is in any country, with every government that comes in, they change laws, override laws. I don't suppose they change them technically, they override the previous law by putting another law in, by their own, what they feel like doing. That's my moral compass, therefore I'm going to do this. One of the main reasons I became a Christian was that reading the Bible, what God has done and continues to do, it doesn't change. I can pick up this Bible and it will be the same now as it was then, and it will be in the future. We can go from government to government and the laws will change every other day. That's where I think I found this hope. That's where I go, thank goodness God is the same all the time. God is unchanging all the time. When I read this Bible, it's consistent all the way through. It's always the same. And I think in this world, we need something that's consistent. We need something that not only promises to be consistent, but it actually is. And Jesus Christ came to fulfill that law. He came to pay for that. He didn't shy away from it. He was grieving in his heart because he knew what was coming, but he never once did he shy away from it. Always, he says, the Father's will. And I think that should give us encouragement. So I'm going to leave you with this. Psalm 119, 1-7 says this: Blessed are they whose ways are blameless, who walk according to the law of the Lord. Blessed are they who keep his statutes and seek him with all their heart. They do nothing wrong, they walk in his ways. You've laid down precepts that are to be fully obeyed. Oh, that my ways were steadfast in obeying your decrees. Then I would not be put to shame when I consider all your commands. I will praise you with an upright heart as I learn your righteous laws. And you might think, how is it that that person can say, I can obey the law? This looks forward to Jesus. He's not actually saying that he can do it. It is because through Jesus Christ, ultimately, that was coming. He knows that's going to be fulfilled. God promises a Messiah that's going to come. Therefore, if I believe in him, I can obey the law. In as much as I might sin and stumble, Jesus obeys the law. Jesus made the law perfect. Jesus helps me to be a believer. Jesus helps the law, makes the law complete. So this when we look at these Psalms, especially, I do encourage you to read the Psalms, because they're so relevant to what we experience today. They're so relevant even back then to today and what we see now. And you might think, if you read these words about laws, and I obey the law and I do the law, it's not the law that you think about. It's not the technicality of the law, as it were. But as a Christian, because of Jesus, you desire to want to do right by God. Because Jesus has done the rightest thing by us, bringing us salvation and saving us. Let's pray together, and then we'll have some worship time.